Have you ever felt lost, not understanding what God is doing in your life? Sometimes we ask for answers, but God's silence can be frightening. The truth is, trusting God doesn't always mean understanding the path, it means believing that He already knows the destination. The Bible teaches us that, "My thoughts are not your thoughts." Isaiah 55 verse 8, showing that His plan always goes beyond what we can imagine. But how can we find rest in the Lord when everything seems meaningless? In this video, you'll discover the benefits of trusting God, even when the journey feels uncertain. Trusting God when everything feels uncertain is one of the greatest tests of faith we face. Our hearts long for immediate answers, but often, God invites us to wait without revealing all the details. This creates anxiety because we want to be in control. However, the Bible teaches us that we walk by faith, not by sight, 2 Corinthians 5 verse 7. Trusting means choosing to rest, even when our minds struggle for explanations. The fear of the unknown can paralyze us and keep us from living out God's plans. When we face changes, challenges, or moments of divine silence, doubt can make us hesitate. Many people walk away from their spiritual journey because they feel like God isn't speaking. But is He truly silent, or is He simply teaching us to trust? We need to remember that faith grows when we lean on Him, not on what we can see. Peter experienced this when he stepped out of the boat to walk on water toward Jesus, Matthew 14 verse 29. At first, he trusted, but when he noticed the strong wind, he began to sink. This teaches us that focusing on circumstances weakens us, but keeping our eyes on God sustains us. When we focus on fear, we drift away from faith. But when we focus on God's faithfulness, we find the strength to keep going. Trusting doesn't mean the absence of fear, it means choosing to move forward despite it. Many times, God leads us down paths that don't make sense to us but are part of a greater purpose. Think about how many situations in your life once seemed like mistakes, only for you to later realize that God was guiding everything. The problem is that we want to understand everything before we obey. But true faith doesn't require explanations, it requires surrender. The more we trust, the more we realize that He has never failed. If you're facing a season of uncertainty today, remember this: God already knows your tomorrow. What seems like a dead end to you might just be the beginning of something incredible He is preparing. Choose to trust, even when you don't understand. Take a step of faith, knowing that He has already gone ahead and is taking care of every detail. You may not see the solution yet, but you can be sure that He has already prepared it. Abraham is one of the greatest examples of trusting God because he obeyed without having all the answers. God told him, "Go from your country, to the land I will show you," Genesis 12 verse 1, without giving details about the destination. Imagine how hard it must have been to leave everything behind without knowing where he was going. Yet, Abraham trusted that if God was leading, the journey would be worth it. This teaches us that faith doesn't require visible guarantees, just a heart willing to obey. Like Abraham, there will be times when God calls us to take steps of faith without revealing the full plan. This can happen in major life decisions, like changing jobs, starting a ministry, or facing unexpected challenges. Our natural instinct is to want answers before we move, but God invites us to trust first. When He leads, He never abandons us, even when it feels like stepping into the unknown. Abraham's obedience didn't just bring blessings to him, it impacted generations. God promised to make him a great nation, and He fulfilled that promise. This shows us that when we trust, we're not the only ones who benefit. Our faith can inspire those around us and open doors we never imagined. But do we have the courage to trust like Abraham, even when we don't understand what God is doing? Many times, we want God to show us the destination before we take the first step. But faith works the other way around. We obey first, and then we see His plan unfold. Abraham didn't ask for all the details, he simply followed God's voice. This challenges us to let go of control and surrender our path to the Lord, knowing that He always has the best for us. If today you feel like God is asking you to trust, even without understanding everything, remember Abraham. The same God who guided his journey is guiding yours. Don't be afraid to take the first step. God's faithfulness never fails. What He has promised, He will fulfill. The only question is, are you willing to trust Him, even when you can't see? There are times when everything feels out of control, and we find ourselves asking, God, what are you doing? The truth is, we can only see the present, but God has already seen the future. He has a plan far greater than we can imagine. In Jeremiah 29 verse 11, God declares, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." This promise reminds us that even when we don't understand, God has already prepared something good for us. When we go through difficult times, we often think that God has forgotten us. But in reality, He is leading us on a path that may only make sense later. Take Joseph, for example. He was sold as a slave, thrown into prison unjustly, and spent years without understanding what God was doing. Yet, every hardship was bringing him closer to his purpose, becoming the governor of Egypt and saving his family from famine. God sees far beyond what we can. What feels like a setback may actually be preparation. Maybe you're facing uncertainty right now and don't see a way out. But remember, nothing happens by chance when we are in God's hands. What seems like a detour might actually be the right path to a greater purpose. We must learn to trust God's timing, even when everything feels unclear. Our mistake is often wanting to understand before we obey. We want God to show us the ending before we take the first step. But faith works the opposite way. We trust first, then we see God move. If we try to control everything, we might end up getting in the way of His plans. But when we learn to surrender control to God, we find peace, even in the middle of uncertainty. If today you feel like you don't understand what God is doing, remember this: He has already prepared the best for you. Your job is not to figure everything out, it's to trust the one who knows all things. In His perfect time, everything will make sense. Are you willing to trust that God's plans are greater than yours? Many times, we try to understand everything through our own logic and end up ignoring God's direction. We want concrete proof before taking a step of faith. However, the Bible teaches us, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Proverbs 3 verse 5. Our vision is limited, but God sees the bigger picture. When we rely only on what makes sense to us, we risk making wrong decisions and drifting away from God's purpose. A great example of this is the story of Sarah and Abraham. God had promised them a child, but as the years passed with no sign of it happening, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. She offered her servant, Hagar, to have a child with Abraham, thinking that was the solution. But that decision brought difficulties to their family and proved that trying to help God isn't always the best path. Our logic is flawed because it's based only on what we can see and understand. But God works in the unseen. Many people miss out on blessings because they make impulsive decisions, relying only on human reasoning. Sometimes, God asks us to wait, but we rush ahead. Other times, He asks us to trust, but we insist on seeing before believing. This often leads us to choices that take us further from God's best for us. Trusting God means letting go of the need to understand everything. It's accepting that He knows what's best, even when it doesn't make sense to us. If we try to figure everything out on our own, we may end up frustrated and overwhelmed. But when we choose to rest in God's sovereignty, we find peace and direction. We must learn to listen to His voice more than our own reasoning. If you've been making decisions based only on your own logic, maybe it's time to pause and ask, God, what is your will? He never fails and always leads His children down the best path. Choose to trust Him, even when the road seems uncertain. After all, who better to guide us than the one who already knows the future? Imagine someone who lost everything and felt hopeless. That was the case for John, a man who, after years of dedication to his job, was suddenly laid off. With a family to support and bills piling up, he was overwhelmed with fear. Logic told him to take any job as quickly as possible, but in prayer, he felt God leading him to wait and trust. It seemed like a risky decision, but he chose to follow God's voice, even without understanding. Months went by, and nothing happened. John began to doubt and wondered if he had really heard from God. Many people advised him to stop waiting and take the safer route. But he remained firm in prayer and worked on strengthening his faith. Just like Abraham, he didn't know where God was leading him, but he chose to trust. It required patience, but he decided to move forward without fear. Then, one day, John received an unexpected call. A company he hadn't even considered offered him a job, one that was far better than his previous position. The salary was higher, the benefits were amazing, and he would have more time for his family. What seemed like a season of failure was actually God redirecting him towards something greater. John realized that if he had made a rushed decision, he would have missed out on the blessing. This story teaches us that trusting God doesn't always mean seeing immediate results. Many times, He asks us to wait because He is preparing something bigger. The delay that feels like a setback may actually be a season of training for something great. John didn't understand the process at first, but in the end, he saw that God had been in control all along. The key was staying faithful, even when things seemed uncertain. If you're going through a season of uncertainty, remember this testimony. God never abandons us, He always has something prepared. It may not make sense right now, but at the right time, everything will fall into place. Are you willing to trust Him, even when you don't see a way out? God might be preparing a miracle for you, just like He did for John. Have you ever spent sleepless nights worrying about the future? Anxiety consumes us when we try to control what isn't in our hands. But God invites us to cast all our worries on Him. Do not be anxious about anything, Philippians 4 verse 6. Trusting God doesn't mean we won't face difficulties, it means we don't have to carry them alone. When we surrender our uncertainties to Him, we experience a peace that goes beyond human understanding. Think of a father holding his child's hand while crossing a busy street. The child doesn't understand the danger but trusts that the father will lead them safely. That's how our faith in God should be. He sees dangers we can't and knows exactly where to take us. But too often, we let go of His hand and try to walk alone, filling ourselves with fear and anxiety. When we learn to trust, we find rest, even in the middle of life's storms. Jesus taught this lesson when He calmed the storm while the disciples were terrified in the boat, Mark 4 verses 35 to 41. They thought they were going to die, while Jesus was peacefully sleeping. This shows us that faith gives us rest, while fear makes us sink. God wants us to learn to rest in Him, knowing that even when the waves are big, He is still in control. Anxiety keeps us trapped in a cycle of worry, but faith sets us free. When we trust God, we don't have to lose sleep over what might go wrong. He is already taking care of everything. The key is to bring every concern to Him in prayer and believe that He is working, even when we don't see it. True peace comes when we stop fighting for control and simply rest in His promises. If your heart is restless today, God has an invitation for you. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will act. Psalm 37 verse 5. He wants to lift the weight of anxiety and replace it with peace. Take a deep breath, surrender your worries to God, and trust. The peace you're searching for isn't found in understanding everything, it's found in knowing that God has already prepared the best for you. Trusting God isn't something that happens automatically, it's a process that needs to be cultivated daily. Faith grows stronger when we learn to hear His voice and depend on Him in every situation. Just like a muscle that needs to be exercised to grow, our trust in God also needs to be developed. But how do we do this in practice? The Bible teaches that faith comes from hearing the Word of God, Romans 10 verse 17. The more we know God, the easier it becomes to trust Him. The first step to unshakable trust is building a real relationship with God. We can't trust someone we don't know. Prayer and reading the Bible are essential for developing this intimacy. When we spend daily time with God, we learn to recognize His voice and become more sensitive to His guidance. Many people want answers from God but don't spend time with Him. How can you trust someone you barely talk to? Another key step is remembering God's promises and testimonies. When we go through tough times, our minds can trick us into thinking that God is distant. But if we look back, we'll see how many times He has already helped us. Write down your experiences with God and remind yourself of the prayers He has answered. Just as David remembered how God rescued him from the lion and the bear before facing Goliath, 1 Samuel 17 verse 37, we must recall the victories God has already given us. We also need to learn to rest in God. Many times, we say we trust Him but still worry as if we have to help Him fix our problems. True trust means letting go and not taking it back. Philippians 4 verse 6 teaches us not to be anxious but to bring everything to God in prayer. When we truly surrender, we find peace. Anxiety fades when we learn to rest in God's promises. Finally, trust grows through experience. God allows challenges in our lives to teach us to rely on Him. The more we go through situations where we have to depend on God, the more we learn that He never fails. If you feel like your faith is weak today, don't give up. Start with small steps, trust a little more each day and watch God move. The more you trust, the more you'll see that He has always been faithful. A lack of trust in God can lead us down dangerous paths. When we doubt, we give fear and anxiety room to take over our hearts. The Bible gives us a clear example of this with the people of Israel. After being freed from Egypt, they started doubting God in the desert. Even after witnessing incredible miracles, they complained, felt afraid, and even wanted to return to slavery. Numbers 14:3-4. As a result, they wandered for 40 years and missed out on entering the promised land. Fear paralyzes us and keeps us from moving forward in God's plans. When we don't trust Him, we make decisions based on insecurity instead of divine direction. This is exactly what happened to Peter when he walked on water. As long as he trusted, he walked on the impossible. But when he started doubting, he began to sink. Matthew 14:30. This teaches us that faith sustains us, but doubt pulls us down. When we focus on circumstances instead of God, we become overwhelmed and lose hope. Another danger of not trusting God is that we end up relying on our own strength, which leads to spiritual and emotional exhaustion. So often, we think we have to fix everything on our own, forgetting that God invites us to cast all our worries on Him. 1 Peter 5:7. When we try to carry burdens that were never meant for us, we wear ourselves out and become frustrated. But God doesn't want us to live that way. He wants us to find rest in Him. Beyond that, a lack of trust can keep us from experiencing the extraordinary plans God has for us. If Abraham had refused to leave his homeland, he would never have become the father of a great nation. If Joseph had given up while in prison, he would never have become the governor of Egypt. God has incredible things in store for each of us, but if we don't trust Him, we risk never stepping into His promises. Doubt keeps us stuck, but faith takes us to places we never imagined. If you realize today that you've been living more in fear than in faith, it's not too late to change. God wants to teach you to trust, one step at a time. Choose today to let go of insecurity and surrender to His plan. He has never failed, and He never will. The question is, will you trust Him, or will you stay trapped in uncertainty? Trusting God when we don't understand the path can be challenging, but it's the best decision we can make. We've seen that uncertainty can create fear, but it can also be an invitation to strengthen our faith. Abraham didn't know where he was going, but he trusted and was blessed. Joseph endured years of hardship before seeing God's purpose fulfilled. Peter sank when he doubted, but he walked on water when he trusted. What do these stories teach us? That God never fails those who choose to trust Him. If you're in a season of uncertainty today, stop and ask yourself, am I truly trusting God, or am I trying to figure everything out on my own? Many times, we want all the answers before taking a step of faith, but God calls us to trust before we understand. The key isn't knowing exactly where God is leading, it's knowing that He is in control. Are you willing to let Him guide your life? Here are 3 practical steps to strengthen your trust in God. 1. Pray every day, surrendering your worries to Him. 2. Read the Bible to remind yourself of God's promises. 3. When fear or doubt arises, declare out loud, God is in control, and I trust Him. Small habits like these shift our mindset and help us live by faith, not fear. Now, I want to hear from you. What challenges you the most when it comes to trusting God? Drop a comment below and share your testimony or prayer request. If this video spoke to you, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future content. And remember, God has already prepared the best for you. Trust Him, because in the end, everything will make sense.